Power is coming directly from the PCM. I really like the look of it with it kind of wrapping around. The Hemi engine is running like it should. We got the thing dropped. If you have an engine that has the MBS solenoids in there, this is definitely a step you'll want to take. Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited and welcome to a supersized edition of Ask a Tech. Now, as always, if you have a question that you would like me to answer, go ahead and post it in the pinned comment down below. Let's get into your questions. So our first question of the day comes from VR Nicastro. He says, hey, I've asked before, but I would love for you to discuss the Ecodiesel. I know you're not a fan. Break it down. Can they be made reliable? I know we can't legally delete them. What would you do to preserve the motor? Yeah, you know, I've kind of resisted talking about the Ecodiesel up to this point. I've kind of known more as a Hemi channel, but I thought this was a good opportunity to go over some of the positives and negatives of that engine platform. So I did write down some information here. Want to cover that. And I do want to express up front that yes, I am a completely biased observer based on my experience with this engine. All right, first things first, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson here to explain exactly how we ended up with the Ecodiesel engine in these half-ton Rams. Now, you can imagine that many people would say, if you have the Cummins engine in the big brother truck, the 2500 and 3500, why do we not have a smaller Cummins in the 1500? Well, originally back in 2008, that was the plan. We were in talks with Cummins, Chrysler was in talk with Cummins to lease their smaller engine that they built, and that engine actually ended up going into the Nissan Titan. Now, what happened was in 2008, when the bankruptcy happened for Chrysler, they had to cancel those contract talks with them. And then when Chrysler got purchased by Fiat, Fiat came in and said, hey, we've got our own diesel company, VM Diesel. So we already make our own diesel engines. Why would we talk to Cummins about it? So that is why we ended up with this 3-liter Ecodiesel engine in the Ram 1500. Now, as I just mentioned, it is a 3-liter V6 turbo diesel. Seems like there's a lot of good components there. Now, primarily when they were designing this engine, their huge focus was on fuel mileage. It wasn't an outright power or pulling power or anything like that. They were focused on gas mileage. Now, to me, by far the biggest issue with the Ecodiesel engine, as mentioned in the question, is the emissions system. And of course, there is no way to bypass that. You have to leave it on there. 90% of the problems we see with the Ecodiesel engine are a direct result of all the emission stuff that they put on there. It is an insane amount of equipment that has to be put on this engine for it to actually pass emissions. In fact, my Chrysler instructor had mentioned to us at one point that just the cost of the exhaust components alone, for that same price, Chrysler can purchase a whole nother Hemi engine and transmission. That is how many emissions components are just in the exhaust, and that is not all of the components. It is absolutely ridiculous. And we do see a lot of issues with those, like the diesel particulate filter. They tend to clog up a lot because, you know, it's an everyday vehicle like a Grand Cherokee. All you're doing is you're driving it to the store and back home again. But you can't do that with a DPF because you have to give them a chance to perform a regen. So you have to be getting out on the highway and doing extended drives. Well, a lot of people, that's not what they do. They just run to the store, come back home again. You do that enough, the diesel particulate filter does not have a chance to perform a regen. It gets all clogged up and it sets a code, and now it says you can only drive, 15 miles an hour from this point forward because your DPF is all clogged up until you perform a regen. So that's just one instance of why I don't particularly enjoy this platform. Now, next up, they've had several emissions related recalls to this point regarding the SCR, the selective catalyst reductant, the DPF itself, the EGR cooler assembly, and the list goes on. Like I said, most of the problems we see with these vehicles are direct result of the emission system. Now, possible intake manifold failure. What's happening is the EGR coolers, they start to leak coolant directly into the intake system, and this superheats it and turns it into a steam, which, because the intake manifold is made out of plastic, can actually burn a hole right through the intake manifold. Now, there's a specific recall for this, so obviously your vehicle would be taken care of if that happened, but I'm just trying to explain some of the things that could potentially happen to the vehicle. Now, just like any other modern diesel, you're going to need diesel exhaust fluid in there. And also, if you have any sort of a fuel contamination issue, like say you get some sort of gas in your diesel or something like that, you need to replace all of the fuel system components. I'm talking all of the steel hard lines, the pump itself, the pump in the tank. I mean, it goes on. It is an insane amount of complexity and cost for just very basic issues that could happen. Now, here's a fun one. The crank position sensor on these engines is behind the flex plate. Now, the tone wheel that it reads off of is magnetic, which is great from a technical standpoint because it provides ultra precise engine positioning. However, it is magnetic bonded to the surface of a steel component. And for whatever reason, these tone wheels are falling apart. At this point, the engine will crank and crank and crank, and you will have a no start condition. Now, I'm not sure, I think they might have actually performed a recall for this situation as well, but my gosh, is it stupid, because to replace it, you have to remove the transmission and then remove the flex plate to even get to that tone wheel. So it's just a huge problem for a really dumb design. It just doesn't make sense where they put that sensor, that tone ring. Now, moving on, I also do not like the way in which they deliver their power. They're really soft on the bottom and then it ramps up quickly after that. That's not the way I want my vehicle to drive. Now, because it is a diesel engine, you're going to have more maintenance responsibility than you would have on a similarly equipped gas vehicle. Specifically, you're dealing with more oil capacity, and so your oil change amounts are going to be higher per interval. And then also you have to replace your fuel filters, and as I mentioned before, you're going to have some DEF fluid in there. To me, the extended cost of all of this maintenance is going to more than cover the amount you might have saved due to potential fuel savings. So for me, the rate of return just isn't there. Now, parts availability, it can be much more difficult to procure parts for these because they're just not quite as common, and the parts are just significantly more expensive than a Hemi counterpart would be. Now, this one I'm not going to say is really fair, but these engines are notorious in shops. Techs don't like to work on them, so they're going to do everything they can to not work on them, which means they're going to charge more to work on these kind of engines. So those costs get passed right on to the customer. Is this fair? Of course it's not, but that's just the way it is. I'm telling you, we do not like working on these engines, therefore it's going to cost a little bit more. Now, interestingly, I'll try to get a shot here on the screen, but the intake ports on this engine are not even 1.5 inches in diameter. They are in fact very, very small. And to me, that causes serious issues because they soot up so fast. Obviously, it's a diesel engine with emission stuff on it, so it's going to have some soot issues, but I have never seen anything like this engine. The ports are so small, they soot up so quickly that after even only 10 to 15,000 miles, your intake ports are about that big because there's so much soot in there. Now, honestly, I think over in Europe, this is actually a pretty solid engine because the engine itself seems to have a good architecture and it actually makes a lot of sense. But once you pile on all the emission stuff that we have to have here in the US because we have more stringent standards here, it just renders this engine with too many issues and too many problems and too many things that you'll have problems with down the line that you just don't want to face. So for me, and especially too, because the original torque rating on this engine was only 420 foot-pounds, which really wasn't that much more than Hemi counterpart anyway. So you think diesel, you're thinking extra torque. Well, not really, that's not the case. It's not really better for towing or anything of that nature. So those are kind of some of the negative things that I've seen from this engine. Let's talk about the positives. You can get up to 30 miles per gallon on the highway. That's it. That's all the positives I have for this engine. Obviously, you can tell I am biased about it. I just don't think it makes sense, especially because you're going to go in with a higher initial cost to try to get one of these engines over a gas engine anyway. So if you're paying that higher premium to start with, and then you're paying higher maintenance costs, are those fuel savings really going to balance themselves out? I honestly don't think though. I think you would have to own the vehicle for 15, 20 years maybe before it even start to show itself. And I just don't think the resale value is there with the Ecodiesel because people are starting to know that there can be some serious issues with them. So I don't think they have a great resale value either. So just to be clear, those are some of the things I've seen with the Ecodiesel engine, and that is why I absolutely recommend sticking with a gas engine versus going with a diesel. All right, next question is about superchargers. Now, I've gotten a lot of questions about this, so I kind of paired a couple together. What are your thoughts on a Vortec or ProCharger supercharger and their kits? They look like a much more economical and beginner-friendly bolt-on option for the 06 Hemis. Is it worth the price tag at around 9 grand, or is it better to go with a traditional supercharger for closer to 12 and have a tech install it? Prices are in Canadian, and the market's kind of bonkers up here for car parts. Yeah, no question about that. That's really high. Hayden says, really enjoy these videos. I would ask the type of supercharger you like, the why, and what you would want to do before supercharging a Hemi. So for me personally, the type of supercharger I like is absolutely a positive displacement supercharger. We're talking like a Roots or a screw type blower. The other type is a dynamic or centrifugal style blower that you see. That's the Procharger or Vortec models. So I like the positive displacement because the way in which it delivers the boost. You're getting a lot of it more down low, right in the meat of things, whereas a Procharger, it's very linear. The more RPM you make, the more boost it makes, kind of along that same line. So it feels more like a naturally aspirated engine would, because it just makes more power as you go along. Now, another question a lot of people have for me regarding superchargers is how much boost can I safely run on a stock bottom end? Now, I gotta say here, guys, this is an extreme generalization because boost is not the same between engines, because all boost is a reflection of a restriction of the airflow capabilities of that engine. So 7 PSI on one engine is not the same as 7 PSI on another engine. But in an extreme generalization, I would say between 6 to 8 PSI is generally a safe number to run on a stock bottom end. Now, if you would like some additional safety protection on a stock bottom end, I would recommend that you remove those stock pistons and open up the ring end gap a little bit. What this does is it prevents those ring ends from touching together under extreme combustion chamber pressure, and then once they do touch, they tend to butt up and they'll actually break the ringland of the piston itself. So that's kind of where the weakness of the stock bottom end is. So again, 6 to 8 PSI is somewhere on the stock bottom end as much as you want to go. Next up, Francisco Martinez says, does the 5.7 still have the problem with the valve seats dropping? The answer to that is no. That is actually a problem that they fixed in 2009. Once they upgraded to the new Eagle heads on there, they no longer had an issue with the valve seats dropping. If you own a pre-2009 Hemi engine, yes, it does have that potential for the valve seats dropping. Generally, we tend to see it more if you have an engine that has been overheated. Once they start to overheat, that's when those valve seats will probably drop out of there. So if you're still running the stock heads on your pre-2009 Hemi engine, I used to say don't worry about it, just drive it, but honestly at this point it is kind of a situation where I might recommend putting some reman heads on there, especially if you're planning to take them off for any other reason. It might make sense to replace those with some reman heads. AA7 says, my 2009 Durango Hemi throws a P0734 code and my trans is shifting hard when the truck gets warm. Is it the valve body that I need to change? Okay, so a P0734 is a gear ratio error in fourth. It's saying that when I should be in fourth gear, my speed sensors are not matching what I think it should be. So the very first thing I would recommend that you do is check out the fluid in there. Is it dark brown or black? Does it smell burned? Anything like that? If it does, you're kind of out of luck at that point, because at that point you would know that you have a lot of slippage happening inside the transmission, your overdrive clutches are burned up, and the transmission will need to be rebuilt. However, if you look at the fluid and the fluid is still red, doesn't smell bad, then maybe I'd start to look at something more valve body related. But usually, in my experience with these transmissions, once you have a gear ratio error code, especially in overdrive like that, yeah, you're probably looking at a trans rebuild. You didn't mention how many miles were on here, but I would say especially if it's 150K plus miles and you have a gear ratio error, probably looking at a trans rebuild at that point. But again, the fluid is going to be the key to that. Check that first. Jeremy Liflam says, how can you diagnose a bad PCM? My 2013 Ram is running poorly. It's not giving me any error codes, but it stumbles on takeoff under load only. Has decreased power and poor gas mileage. There's a strong gas smell at startup that I also noticed the other day. So let me start this off by saying it is actually extraordinarily rare to have a bad PCM. Of course it does happen, but generally it's the very, very last thing on my list that I'd be checking. In a situation like this sounds more like a drivability issue, meaning I would be looking at things like performing a tune-up on there, checking the condition of your spark plugs, things like that. Those are all things that are going to affect this more than, say, a bad PCM would be. Now, specifically, you mentioned that it's having decreased power and poor gas mileage and a strong gas smell. I'm kind of wondering what your oxygen sensors are doing. If your oxygen sensors are reading incorrectly and they're commanding more fuel than is actually necessary, then you could have all of these problems that you're talking about. So unfortunately, that's one of those things where you'd need a more complex scan tool so you can look at what's called the fuel trim data. You got short-term and long-term. I'd be looking specifically at the long-term fuel trim and see if it keeps adding more and more and more fuel. If it is, then you could potentially be having an issue with your oxygen sensors where they are failing and commanding all this fuel that's not actually needed, which again could lead to all these problems. But it wouldn't actually set a code because it doesn't know that it's recommending this thing incorrectly. So that would be my recommendation. Let's check out the long-term fuel trim on your oxygen sensors first, and also check the condition of your spark plugs. Chuck Rice asks, 392 intake from my 5 cent Hemi Challenger, long tubes and a Joker cam. or use my mod money to get a higher trim. Be nice to maintain my current expense level but get faster. Everyone keeps telling me to just get a Hellcat. You know, I do think that there's something though to modifying the vehicle on your own, and then it becomes yours, right? Because you have put these parts on there and it's a little bit more special. Yes, I think it does make sense in a lot of cases to end up with the 392 model because it's just, I feel like it's just a better car, period, and I just really enjoy the way it delivers its power. However, if you already have the 5.7 and you just use some extra money to go ahead and put some of these parts on there, it sounds great, it drives great, you have a little bit more power, and it's now yours because you were the one that made the decision to put these things on here. So again, when you drive somewhere, okay, there could be a lineup of 7 392 powered cars that are all identical because they're stock, and yes, you may just have a 5.7, but you got some custom parts on there and that makes it special. So I do think there's something to be said for that. All right, Abdullah asks, ever since I bought a 2016 Challenger about a year ago, ever since I bought it, there was a knock sound coming from small bumps, usually in low speeds only. Now he goes on to mention a couple of things he did to try to fix this thing or have it inspected. Now, I have a very clear sense straight off the bat of something that I want you to check, and it's actually very simple and inexpensive to change, and that is the sway bar end links. The sway bar end links on these cars always go bad, and they make that clunk noise on those bumps at low speed. Super, super annoying, but it's very cheap to replace them with a new set. So that was absolutely what I would recommend to you first. So you can't really feel it sometimes just grabbing the sway bar end links and yanking them around with your hand. It's not enough force for you to really tell if there's that issue. But I would say just get a new set of the sway bar end links, bolt them on, and see if that problem goes away. He mentioned that another shop told him it could be the steering assembly itself. That's a possibility, but honestly, by far I recommend putting in these sway bar end links first before you do anything else. Boyd Moore Jr. asks, is it possible to put the Eagle heads on an 06 engine? Yes, it is, but I'm going to cover that in a different video. I'm going to actually show you, because I have both engines in my possession, I'm going to show you what the pre-Eagle and post-Eagle engines are like, what the differences are, and what all parts are required to actually make that swap happen. So stay tuned for that. Martin Wappler asks, this is going to sound like kind of a daft question given the Hemi's reputation as gas guzzler. I've seen as high as 30 miles per gallon on the highway in my 2014 300C all-wheel drive with a 5.7, which is amazing, honestly. Now I'm curious, can I get 400 to 450 crank horsepower performance while maintaining my ability to get decent economy on the highway? If so, what kind of mods am I looking at? So an important thing to note here, this is what I always like to point out to people, is that your fuel that you're using has a certain amount of stored energy in it. You can't get more from that. So you're making a compromise. If you want more power, you're gonna get less fuel economy because you're gonna use more volume of that fuel to generate that power. So there's always going to be a trade-off there, one or the other. Now, that being said, you can make a custom tune. Now, I'm assuming on this vehicle, you still have your MDS enabled, so you still have your 4-cylinder mode. Especially if you have some really unique custom tuning, you could do some things like that where you could still have that big power when it's in 8-cylinder mode, but as soon as it drops into 4-cylinder mode, then you can have some really unique things happening. I'm talking running it 17, 18, 19 to 1 air fuel ratio under cruise situations, even higher under decel situations. There's some really weird things that tuners can do to eke out even just that last little bit of mile per gallon. So there is a way to accomplish it, and I would say primarily doing that is through tuning. Maniac FPV asks, I have asked a question before, but I was just curious about something about general maintenance. Is changing the transmission and differential fluid important? And if so, do we need to do a full-on flush or just drain, refill, and swap the transmission filter? He's talking about a 2010 Challenger RT Auto, so he's talking about a nag transmission. Now, service interval calls for every 60,000 miles to do a trans service. That is a drain and fill with a new fluid filter and also a new pan gasket. That is what I recommend. Every 60,000 miles, go ahead and do that service. A full-on fluid flush isn't strictly necessary unless you have cause to suspect that your current fluid has some contaminants in it or has some issues with it. So just a general trans service is more what I would say. Now, if you're talking about the 8-speed transmission, that is technically a fill for life transmission, but I would still recommend changing that around every 100,000 miles. Before that, don't touch it, it's fine. As far as the differential fluid goes, kind of depends on how hard you drive your vehicle, but I would say a good rule of thumb is every 30,000 miles, go ahead and change that diff fluid. JN states, I have a 2011 Durango Crew with a 3.6 and rear wheel drive. I'm wanting to know which would be the easier drivetrain swap, the 5.7 out of an RT Durango or the 392 from an SRT Durango. I know a lot of people will say just buy one of the other models, but I'm more of the built, not bought mentality. I already plan to buy a wrecked vehicle to pull everything from, but like I said at the beginning, I want to know which would be the easier way to go. You know, Jay, I'm the same as you. I'm definitely of a built, not bought mentality. I would rather do things that are really weird and odd myself. However, I would say that in this particular case, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to do that swap. And I only say that for this reason, because if you were doing something ultra unique, like putting a 392 engine in a vehicle that it completely does not belong in, that's cool and interesting and unique. But to do all of this work just to get a 392 in a vehicle where it's already available, it doesn't make as much sense to me, and I'll tell you why. Because modern vehicles, it's not about the mechanical side of things. The mechanical side is the easy part. It's all about the electrical. Now you say you're gonna buy a wrecked vehicle that already has all these components you can swap over, but it gets very difficult because you have a number of different computer modules that are all talking to each other. They're all connected. It's called a CAN bus system, a controller area network. And in this case, I'm just gonna list a few of the modules that talk to each other on this vehicle. First off, you're looking at a TIPM, a totally integrated power module. Obviously the PCM, the powertrain control module. You have a TCM, the transmission control module. A BCM, a body control module. You have a WCM, or wireless control module, or you have an RFH, a radio frequency hub. You have a IPC, an instrument panel cluster, and that's just to name a few. Now these modules are all tied together in that all of them store in them what kind of vehicle they're in and what sort of VIN number it has, all of that. So if something doesn't match in there, it won't let the vehicle run because it says something weird is going on here and this shouldn't be this way. So if this is a swap you're interested in, you would have to swap every single one of these modules, and you would have to swap all of the body wiring harness as well, the whole entire thing from vehicle to vehicle. This means gutting the entire vehicle just to swap all this stuff over. You have to use the keys from the donor vehicle, pretty much everything. So it is a huge hassle, and you have to have some advanced knowledge about electronics, and it would also help even more if you had a tuner on your side that could help you with some of these aspects. So it's not just about taking the mechanical components and swapping them over. That is the easy part, that's the obvious part, not too hard to do. It's all about the electronics in this case. So again, my recommendation is if you're thinking about doing something like that, definitely try to do something a bit more off the wall where it makes sense to go through that sort of effort, because just trying to swap everything over, it really doesn't make sense in this scenario. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for this episode of Ask a Tech. A lot of really great questions this time around. I'm really looking forward to the next episode. Stay tuned to the channel if you want to see more Hemi-based content, and we will see you next time on Reignited.